Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and welcome back. This is episode 92, and boy, do I have a special for you. We have been doing the Wild Wild Country series throughout the summer, and now this is the grand finale as I'm no longer taking and studying for the bar. But we have a very, very special guest joining us, along with co-host Daniel and Robert of the Actual Anarchy podcast, and that is Sherry Voluntary, formerly of Speaking Freely, and now of the Sherry Voluntary Show and Postcards from Somalia. And she's going to, as we close out the Wild Wild Country series here, episodes 5 and 6, she is going to be helping us kind of dissect those last two episodes as we put a nice big bookend here on the series. So without further ado, Sherry Voluntary, how's it going? This is your first time on the Liberty Weekly podcast.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get into this subject with you guys because I was a member of a non-traditional religious group myself for 27 years. So I feel like I can provide some insight into this documentary, which is a fantastic documentary. I think they did a really, really good job with it.
Right, and there's just so many libertarian topics to pick apart here, but also, other topics that are super interesting that go beyond the scope of libertarianism, possibly, and into spirituality. So, I just wanted to say the entire series for this can be found at libertyweekly.net/WWC, but also the show notes will be at libertyweekly.net/92. This will also appear on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org under the podcast section. So really excited to get going here. And why don't I just hand it off to our co-host Daniel, just to bring us in, set the scene. Where are we at, bud?
All right. Well, where we're at is we are from the Actual Anarchy podcast, which can be found at actualanarchy.com. We talk about movies from a Rothbardian and anarcho-capitalist perspective. We also have a normie-friendly version called The Last Nighters. That can be found at lastnighters.com. It's also featured on thelaunchpadmedia.com, as is Sherry's show, Postcards from Somalia. She's the Tuesday show, we're the Monday show. And I think there was a little bit of contention because she wanted Monday, but I was like, no, I'm getting Monday. So anyway, that's our little plug. Robert's my co-host, and you'll hear from him in a minute. Probably a lot on this episode because he has about 1,000,002 questions for Sherry here. But if I recall, the last episode was 4, and we did that with Peaceful Treason, and those guys are excellent and great. And that was a fun episode to do. And there was this big buildup of, at the end of episode 4, Sheila, Sherry, I'm looking at you on the screen here. Sheila had left the compound after trying to kill the doctor who was going to assist in Osho committing suicide. And it was a botched attempt to kill him. And then there was another botched attempt on the life of one of the officials in Oregon, I think the attorney general or the assistant attorney general, something like that. It's all a little bit fuzzy at the moment. But that very end of episode 4 is Osho addressing his flock, saying that if the police aren't going to find you, I'm going to mete out my own justice and we will find you. And it's this, tension building music crescendo, like this dramatic cliffhanger. And where episode 5 picks up is Sheila, I'm going to keep mixing them up, sorry, has left and is now in Europe, and she's sort of trying to find her way outside of, into a new world that she's unfamiliar with, because her whole adult life was related to being in the Rajneeshis. And that was the only way of life that she knew. And so I want to kind of throw this to you, Sherry. What's it like leaving something that you've been in for so long and then going out into the world that is somewhat new and different? Because Sheila, she left and then she had to go and find people who were still sort of part of the Rajneeshi, but weren't privy to, I guess, information and travel as quickly then, that she had sort of been excommunicated in a way. And so she was able to kind of rely on some of those established networks from the Rajneeshis.
Yeah, we weren't, the group that I was a part of wasn't as, at the time I left anyways, it wasn't off from the rest of the world. So we didn't live on I didn't live on a compound. Um, the group I was with does have campuses where people do live, but I did not live on one of those. So um, yeah, I had friends and neighbors that weren't necessarily involved, but most of the friends that you make are with this kind of idea of bringing them into the fold. So um, there weren't a lot of people that I was close with that were outside the group. Most of the people that make up your friends and all of your social uh, calendar is pretty much taken up with the group. So it's pretty disorienting when you leave. It's also, there's a real sense of loss. And I think the loss is genuine because you are losing a community. And I think you really see that with Sheila and Jane, I believe her name is, that regardless of, not everything's bad, right? And there has to be, they're providing some kind of value there because people go there to get whatever it is they're offering. And you really do build genuine relationships, very deep relationships with people because you feel like it's you with them against the world, or you with them. You're really striving to build something together. There's this unity of purpose. And with my group, we basically lived together. We did everything together. Raised our kids together, and we had meals together a lot, and we just lived our lives. If when I moved to Tennessee, people were here to help me move in. We were moved in right away to our apartment. It was set up. The women come over and clean. When you're sick, people will bring you food. So there's really a lot of love and care directed at you and you to other people. There's a lot of service that goes on. And so there's a real sense of community, which I think a lot of people are missing out on in, just our world in general today in the country. And so I think that's one of the things that attracts people to these groups is that sense of community and real community, not just networks, but real community of people that love you and care about you and are there for you when you need someone. So it's scary when you leave that group. I've often thought, well, who's going to be around for me when I'm old? That's one of the things I think about. Who's going to be around for me when I'm old? What am I going to do? And so I think there's a lot of loss that you feel and a lot of emptiness because your time is not filled up with these activities and people anymore.
All right. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you for that answer. I was curious if, because Sheila left with Jane and Jane had started looking to Sheila as sort of her guru, if you will, if that was sort of just remnant of this is what they've known. And so that's the structure that sort of naturally continued on when they broke away from Rajneeshpuram.
Yeah, it's kind of like the person who stops smoking, does the Nicorette gum, but stays on Nicorette for 15 years. It's just the same sort of thing. There's still that structure there, that safety of someone that understands you. Like one of the things that when I left the group, people don't talk like we talk. We had our own inside language, as so many groups do, and I had to start reminding myself not to use certain words in a certain way because people didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't understand terms in the same way I did. Also, one thing I did want to bring up, I thought was interesting, is that when they burnt Sheila's robes and all the books and were blaming her for the religion, that it was a religion because she made it a religion and how evil Sheila is, and they were kind of washing their hands of everything. There is an Eastern custom, and it is in the Bible as well, called burning the chaff. And it was when they would like thresh the wheat and they would throw it up in the air so that the grains would drop, but all the light stuff that doesn't belong in would fly away. And we practiced a ceremony every year called burning the chaff, where you would burn anything that wasn't serving you anymore. And it might just be symbolic. You might write down something. And I thought that was really interesting that they burnt her items kind of that saying that she was that chaff that was holding them back from spiritual attainment.
Well, it really, so when Sheila leaves and, Osho is still with the group, it really made me wonder because automatically Sheila was just replaced Osho in Switzerland. It seemed like she had her own smaller following, but it really made me wonder, whether you're right that they were just so used to having a master that they globbed onto Sheila because they were, having maybe withdrawals is the wrong term to use, but whether because Sheila was a huge personality too, and it made me wonder whether or not, were the people in the original cult, did they glob onto Osho because of Sheila, or where does the line split between these two figures? Because, like I said, yeah, Sheila is just this huge personality, and in some ways, I think sociopathic.
Yeah. I don't know if you wanted me to answer it. I think, yes, they did do that. And I think we have to remember that, especially in the East, in India and in those religions, these seekers, the relationship between guru and disciple is, they consider that closer than man and wife, closer than mother and child. So it is very difficult for them to leave their master, and so without replacing that somehow, it's almost traumatic, for the disciple to leave. So I think that's probably what they did to kind of psychologically guard themselves. And I mean, I admire her tenacity and her strength of will. Like, she's an interesting woman, so I can see why they, you don't know, you're unstable in the world, and so you kind of stay anchored with this really strong personality.
And I thought it was strange too, just the way that she seemed to be hiding out in Switzerland, like some kind of a reverse Nazi war criminal, and maybe I don't mean to be, so stark with my comparison, but it was so interesting because, yeah, now she's in a caregiving function, and it doesn't seem like any controversies have really followed her since then. Yeah, that was just an observation on Wild Wild Country itself. But Robert,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Sheila. Or
No,
oh my gosh,
It's contagious.
So
Just say-
wait, so Sherry is Sheila, or is she the Sheila of her organization? So is she? I don't know. Never mind. Hey, it's me, Robert, awkwardly trying to step into this conversation. Can we? I know we want to tie this all in with Wild Wild Country, and I do too, but I really want to get into Sherry's, mindset. I mean, you were an adult when you first joined this group, or were you in your teens? Walk me through the process of how you got into it.
Okay. Well, I was 13 when you can't join this group. They don't have a membership. Okay. The only members are like the board of directors. So, there is no membership technically, but I became a member, when I was 13. My first date, actually, who became my first boyfriend, his parents, they did in-home, they call them fellowships. And there's small groups like the first century Christian church used to do. They meet in homes. There are no church buildings. And it's very communal, as far as, you really live with these people, and it's very family oriented, very, very warm and inviting at the time I joined. I guess to give you a little history, um, it started in the 30s and 40s. There was a man who was in the traditional church and wasn't happy with certain things, so did research and brought it back to the church, and they didn't like what he was teaching. And so he went out to Haight-Ashbury, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, where the hippies were hanging out, and about 300 hippies followed him back home to his farm in Ohio. And that was the beginning of the group that I was a part of. So when I joined in 1990, that man had died in the late 80s, and there had been a big break in the group over power, over who was going to take over next. And so I joined right after that. So it was still had some of this hippie type ideals with it. Yeah, there weren't so many restrictions on sexuality. I smoked my first joint there, like, but it was very Christian. It was very. I thought how they talked about it in Wild Wild Country was really interesting, because when Osho, after Sheila leads the group and he says, I'm not religious, I'm not for any religion, I don't, that was my group. They always said religion was the bad thing, because that's the Phariseeism, the letter of the law type stuff. And so we're believers in the word of God, right? So it's parsing words, but it matters when you get into the dynamics of the group and how they view themselves. So we saw ourselves as sort of these radical Christians that were different. And for me, coming from my background, I came from a very impoverished background, a very abusive background. And so I was really, it makes you feel special when you're in a group like that. And for a person who is already vulnerable and who already needs a lot of love and attention, it's very, very appealing. And I was brought up as a Christian, not in one church. My mother let us go anywhere we wanted. So we went with our friends to a lot of different ones. But this was the first one where they're like, made me feel really special. Like, you're one of the ones who gets it. Everybody else doesn't get it, but you get it, So the more receptive you are, it's kind of like the gang that says, well, they might not love you, but hey, you're one of us now. And even though we don't treat you that great, you're one of us and we'll fight for you. It's sort of that same sort of thing, only in a more loving way. But that's, I guess, in the roundabout way, that's how I got involved. And what sort of kept me going back was that sense of specialness, and it's us against the world, and, really feeling like I had answers that other people didn't have access to.
So,
We
Sherry,
were
you're
the
basically describing how we thin libertarians feel in regards to Ancapistan. And so I kind of have this overall question, like Rajneeshpuram was almost, in my mind, like a proto Ancapistan. And the government,
Mhm.
of course, took offense to that and were willing to bring force and violence to the bear to prevent that from happening. And, I do feel like we have a vision of what is true and what is correct. And it sounds pretty pretentious to say that, but I mean, the non-aggression principle, it's not 100% like going to answer every question, but the whole concept of not initiating force against somebody who's a peaceful person seems to be a pretty universal ideal that can be practiced by everyone at the same time without uh, impacting the rights of another. So it is a I don't know, compatible kind of ideal that everyone could practice simultaneously. And so I just wanted to sort of steer this to, do you guys see the Rajneeshis as sort of like a model? Because like Sherry, what you were saying is you were made to feel special, and like you were part of this group and people would stand up for you and protect you, and that you guys had an awareness that the normies out in the world don't have. I kind of feel like maybe we can take some of these lessons, maybe not all of them. We don't need to go around like attempting to murder people or stab them with needles, but they were very successful for a time, and so I just kind of want to throw that out there. I mean, whoever wants to take off on that, maybe Sherry, start with you because you're on my screen and I'm talking at you right now. But can we go in this direction just for a few minutes before Robert goes through his other list of 94 questions for you?
Yeah. I do. I mean, as far as that, they had a new vision of how society could be, maybe, yes. Of course, there are a lot of things about Rajneeshpuram that we wouldn't think are the best way to go, but they were living on their, trying to develop their own little society and trying to leave everyone alone. I feel like they weren't all the way right, but they were really pushed into the positions. I mean, they went too far, but they were radicalized by that force. When people initiate force against a group, that's when they really start to close off and become isolated and radicalized. And so I feel like that's what happened. And you actually cut off people's access to the outside world. And it seems to have happened in that group, maybe not to the same ends that it happens in a lot of group and happened in my group, but they did seem to get more isolated, more insulated, and more radicalized. And more under the control of the power structure, people, the higher ups in the group. But I mean, the government was just ridiculous in that situation, and that's, I think it's a good example of what could possibly happen if a bunch of anarcho-capitalists bought some land, because I've heard people talk about it and started their own little deal. It's the same thing. The government's not going to just let you do what you want. It
Well, right.
challenges the
Oh, sorry, Sherry. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but well, in Should We Be Surprised? Jeff Deist had that very polarizing speech. I don't know if that was last summer or the summer before, but just talking about how normal people don't care about abstractions. Normal people care about the people they love. They care about their homes, their families, their friends and their connections. Should we be surprised in the same way that we shouldn't be surprised, when the United States meddles in areas that they don't belong across the world, that the populace tends to hate them? Should we be surprised that the Rajneeshis became radicalized when their community was threatened by external forces? But I had another question for you there, Sherry. So in some ways, you're coming to this community, you're seeking fellowship, and you get fellowship, and you get these strong bonds and this community connection. At any point, and maybe this should be addressed further down in the episode, but I'm going to throw it to you now. But at any point, did it become isolating from the outside? Because as libertarians, one reason why I even started this show was because I discovered Rothbard, and I was so charged by these ideas, and I wanted to share them with everyone. But at the same time that I had found community, I also felt very alone from the outside. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, it definitely became isolating. I remember thinking at one point, like, wow, I don't know anybody who's not involved in this group. Like, no, I have no friends outside of this group. There are people I work with, they're my acquaintances, but they're not a part of my life. So, yeah, there's definitely an isolation, and a lot of that isolation comes from when the group is attacked and the leadership already has a lot of power in your life. They sort of circle the wagons because they feel attacked, and they are being attacked. I mean, our group was under surveillance by the government at points, from what I understand. And um there were a lot of articles. At one point, it was the fastest growing non-traditional religious, Christian group in the country, in the 80s. And so uh, there were quite a few people involved, and then this split happened, and there were a lot of offshoots. And then that's when there was a lot more attack, because you had people who had left the group angry and were disenfranchised from it, or had been sent out, excommunicated, so to speak. And so that makes the group smaller, but it also makes the group more powerful in the lives of the people who are left there. Because for one, you feel like, and we called ourselves this, and I think libertarians will be familiar with the remnant. We call ourselves the remnant. We're the real believers who are standing with the ship. We're going to go down with the ship, and that's something that it sort of gets cemented into you, that you're one of the faithful, and you're going to stick it out. And so you'll put up with things that you wouldn't if you weren't so isolated, because many of us had been encouraged as well to not have a relationship with our families if our families were too negative about our spiritual choices. So you do become very isolated from your friends and family that you had before, and they don't speak your language anymore, really, and they often don't know what you're talking about, and they're concerned for you, and so yeah, you can get isolated pretty quickly
It sounds like when I
from
became an anarchist. Like all my former friends, I mean, they're so like they're in the matrix still, so they can't see the violence for what it is, and so it does become sort of isolating in a way. And Robert and I have talked about this many times, but it ruins a lot of things for you. Things you used to enjoy are no longer fun or interesting because you realize that it's just bread and circuses, or it's propaganda, or it's fucking bullshit. Sorry, Liberty Weekly listeners, that I'm swearing. But then through some of the efforts that I've made online, like there's a way to have community now. We're in the Tom Woods group together, and I've made a lot of friends in there. Patrick and I and Robert and a few others are part of the Libertarian Union, which is a collection of like-minded podcasters, and we support each other. We're on each other's shows like now. And that can be found at libertarianunion.com. Sherry, you and I and Robert are on the Launchpad Media. So there are, in a way, like digital social communities that are sort of forming around ideas. And I think that's pretty cool, pretty powerful. I hope at some point to be able to be physically more free as well. And I'm not sure where I'm taking this, but I just sort of see some early modeling of what you could sort of achieve with an Ancapistan type scenario, and some lessons we can learn from the Rajneeshis and maybe improve upon.
Yeah.
And right, but I think it's also important to make inroads to other communities, to the normies, as we would say, reach out an olive branch. And I've been struggling with this personally, just trying to balance my real professional life in the real world and my contacts there, because I'm trying to bring liberty to them, and I'm trying to, teach them about these ideas, and I value those people. And especially when it comes to, talking about police or agents of the state, they're good people. I think they really are good people in their hearts, but they're just doing bad things, and so maybe I wanted to ask you, Sherry, how, since you've come back, how have you been able to interact with the real world? Well, I shouldn't say the real world, but the rest of the world. Oh, do we still have her?
Did we lose Sherry?
Yeah, she might be frozen, but maybe she can try to reconnect. And let's go to Robert. What do you think about the last couple of things we've been talking about? I'm sure you've got plenty at the top of mind there.
Oh, I've got thoughts, boys and girls. So what occurred to me while everyone was making all kinds of varied and interesting points was when Sherry's talking about her experiences in her organization is very much mirrored my growing up as part of having my mother be in the Baha'i faith, where it's not the level to which they have churches. They're not that successful. They're perfectly open with their beliefs, but they're not, successful enough to do that. So they meet at each other's houses, and they keep it decentralized. And when you're decentralized, there's no one target for the government or the state to really go after and destroy. And I wonder if the Rajneeshis, one of their further mistakes was really centralizing there in this one location, which the government could then target and really put the pressure on and squeeze and then destroy ultimately. Whereas, meanwhile, Rajneeshism continues, just spread all over the world, and there's no one necessarily target that anybody can point at and destroy to totally ruin the place. So taking that lesson to Ancapistan, it certainly seems like, I don't know if the Free State Project is going to ever turn into anything, or it's working out or not, but I really don't think that a bunch of libertarians maybe, getting together and building a Rajneeshpuram, might not be the best idea. I don't know, but especially not with any one like figurehead the at the head of the snake there. I don't know if Sherry's group, it seemed like they had some sort of a tribunal or a council that kind of led the group, and not necessarily a single person. So that's good. I don't know. What any do we have her back yet? No.
Not yet, but I've got a couple of things to go off based on what you've said already. I think you're right that the decentralization is pretty key in not being able to shut something down, not being able to focus their efforts in a certain area to stymie people trying to achieve freedom. Though I do see smaller groups within the same kind of ideals forming together for that local physical social community. So maybe not like everyone moves to Rajneeshpuram and Kapistan, but maybe there's little pockets, like how the expats work in, going to like Costa Rica or Mexico or other countries. Like they tend to coalesce in certain areas and interact with each other on a social level. I can sort of see that sort of thing working, and then also combine that with the social community that's happened online, right?
Right, but do you ever see like a group of ANCAPs like forming a city, and like incorporating and like filing paperwork with the state, and we are the city of Ancapistan and blah blah blah? It just sounds like you're creating a target.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the seasteading thing. There's the Liberland or whatever it was in like the former Yugoslavia or wherever area in Eastern Europe.
Right.
There's Liechtenstein. There's Doug Casey's talked about trying to convince an African dictator to adopt free market principles and become sort of like a Hong Kong type area to attract, entrepreneurs with free market ideals and free trade.
Wouldn't that be amazing if some, sub-Saharan country in Africa just adopted full free market principles and become this wealthy country beyond all, like a Hong Kong? And then what would the argument be against that? It would just be
amazing.
It would be incredible. And how could they, I mean, I don't even know what the leftist argument against Hong Kong is, but I'm sure they got something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's too capitalist, so that's a big problem for them. And I think Sherry's still trying to connect here, but let's maybe shift this over a little bit to the moment in the episode where Osho decides to leave, and at the time it looks like a very foolish mistake. Like even the government people, when they're being interviewed, are like, I can't believe he did this. It's like a really dumb thing to go ahead and do, to try to escape via aircraft to make it to, I think, the Bahamas or somewhere that didn't have extradition. I think that was the plan, but he had to fly all the way from Oregon across the entire country and make 2 or 3 fuel stops along the way because their aircraft could only go, 1,100 miles or something like that with the range. And as soon as they knew that he was leaving, they were immediately tracking his progress and trying to triangulate where he was going to land and then arrest him. And they eventually do, I think, in North Carolina. But the other side of it is, had he not left, the government was ready to bring the full force of like the Army Reserve and the sheriffs and, like full body armor people descending upon Rajneeshpuram with a violent assault. So in a at the end of the day, he ended up doing the right thing because there would have been bloodshed had he not done that.
Absolutely, he did. And I tend to think that he knew what was going to happen. Although, if I recall correctly, he was never actually charged with anything until he left. Like they were preparing the indictment, and the lawyers were kept asking them, "Hey, do you have an indictment? Are you going to be serving this anytime soon? We want to negotiate with you." And the attorney general was basically stonewalling them. So, and preparing these, this military assault. So, I mean, I want to ask you this question. I saw that Osho, or the lawyer guy, he thought it was a bad idea that Osho had left. And you seem to think that maybe initially it seemed that it was a bad idea, Osho leaving, because he's somehow admitting guilt by trying to flee. Is that what you're saying? Like guilty people run and that sort of thing, and innocent people stay where they are? Because if I'm him, I mean, first of all, yes, I'm doing a great thing by, preventing this violent assault that's about to happen, or not giving the government an excuse to violently assault us. But also, maybe I'm just fed up and I've had enough. And clearly I'm not wanted here, and I'm going to go somewhere else. I haven't been indicted with anything. I'm not accused of anything. So I'm just going to leave. And by what right does all of a sudden the United States, now that I'm flying away, they're like, oh no, we got to get him because he's trying to get out of here. And then when they catch him, they're just like, oh, okay, well, now you have to leave. It was the biggest waste of all time.
Yeah, it seemed like they were just trying to be punitive with him at that point. And I don't remember the explicit details because I'll admit I haven't watched episode 6 in a while now. But I think he knew that they were going to come after him. And so that's why he left. Now, when I said that it seemed like a foolish move, I was saying that was what everyone seemed to think in the documentary. Like the government agents said, it's weird that he's running. And even Swami
Pramnin,
the lawyer guy, was like, oh, it was a foolish thing to do. But it ended up being the right thing. And perhaps Osho did know that they were going to raid the town, and the town was armed. I mean, that was one of the big issues in the earlier episodes, that everyone was concerned that these people had well-armed, people, well-trained people to defend themselves. So to think that the government could just descend upon this area and not have any violence result is ridiculous. And it just goes to show you the mindset of the government agents, and to then see a few years later the Waco incident and Ruby Ridge and all these things happen, it's in their playbook.
Yeah, and they seem to, if they had conducted this raid and there had been massive violence, then all of that storyline would just be, look at how evil these people were. See, we knew it all along, that these people were just violent scumbags and we had to kill them all. When hopefully I would like the actual storyline to be, look at all this horrific aggression that the government perpetrated, and these people were willing to defend themselves and this friend of theirs with, violent, deadly force. But the narrative would have been the Rajneeshis, what monsters. Glad we got rid of them.
Right. Well, that's all we hear about the Waco thing, right? Like how evil they were. Now, I don't know enough about it to really speak much more than that, but I know that that's how it's presented, and I'm pretty sure there's another side to the story.
Well, right. And this is just like, Waco Part 1. Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned too the lawyer's role in this all, because as a lawyer, he should know that there's certain steps to admitting evidence of flight at trial. And I'm reaching way back a couple of years here to my evidence class, because this is such a specific problem. But I believe you have to, in order for evidence of flight to be admitted at trial, because I think the probative value is pretty low and it's highly prejudicial. So people would hear that, oh, he ran, and then they would just assume he must have done it. That's a guilty conscience because he ran. But there are certain steps towards, establishing that flight is admissible at trial. So you have to prove first, you have to connect the suspect's behavior to flight. Then you have to connect the behavior of flight to a guilty conscience. And then you have to connect the guilty conscience to actual guilt. I think there's either 3 or 4 steps. Forgive me for not remembering them. So I think the lawyer should know that, if this would ever go to trial, he would have to argue against that, or the prosecution would have to argue against that. But yeah, I think it was a good step for Osho to leave. But we have a really interesting take too from the Osho Times, from Rajneesh International. They did write an editorial about specifically the docuseries, and surprise, surprise, they're not super happy with it. But they're saying essentially, and I'm quoting here, essentially, this was a U.S. government conspiracy from the White House on down, aimed at thwarting Osho's vision of a community based on conscious living. The extent of these government efforts has only come to light after repeated applications made via FOIA requests. White House involvement included President Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese. In Congress, Senators Hatfield and Packwood of Oregon and Senator Dole of Kansas. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, from the most senior officials to the local investigators. They're kind of rambling here. On the state level, organized. These politicians pressured every available government entity, including the IRS, the INS, and the judiciary, to do their best to, quote, get rid of these people. So I can't really disagree with them here. I mean, knowing what happened in Ruby Ridge later on, that was under Clinton, I believe, right? Clinton?
Sounds right.
But
92, right? Wasn't it?
I believe so. And then, for our content purposes too, at the end they say a little bit about the abolition of private property.
The irony of that. Yeah. We'd made this point earlier on previous episodes with some of the other great guest hosts that you had lined up for this, that it really looked like the government was just looking for whatever they could to get rid of these people. And even if they had to twist the intent and utility of the law in question, they were willing to do it. Like the key issue that I remember was when they brought in the homeless people to establish that they could vote, and they were following they had to be in the county for 30 days and go down to the courthouse and register, and they were supposed to be granted this ability to vote, this registration. And the government just said, no, go away. And it was just one example of them impeding them, even using their own, like it really was a fight over wresting control of the government or the laws that were in place at the time on either side. And of course, you're going to lose that game when the government is out to get you. And it's not paranoia. I mean, they were literally out to get them. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I didn't mean to derail you here, Patrick.
Yeah, no problem. I was just thinking about, back in episode 5, they were saying how, because the whole Rajneeshpuram, the entire village was wiretapped, right? And the attorney general or whoever's the prosecutor that was going off acted so like offended of this wiretapping case. And it was like, dude, the NSA, man, the NSA. But even to scold the Rajneeshis a little bit in terms of their blind kind of faith in this collective power, the type of society that they established trusted power in the hands of a very small few. And to me, it just does not, it's not surprising. It's just another example of how, it's the ring of power, to make a Tolkien analogy, which was the same analogy that we're making. You can't trust the ring of power in anyone's hands. And that kind of faith, the abolition of private property, you have all these people that are voluntarily, mind you, but maybe tricked a little bit. But they seemed, subjectively to enjoy this transfer and to enjoy the benefits of being part of the community.
I will say one thing about their abolition of private property. It seemed to be only applicable to their community. And to me, that's fine. You go do communism over there. We're going to do ANCAPism over here. And if you hear about how great things are going on over here, don't come expecting that you can just take it. We'll trade with you.
I mean, no problem here either. They're totally fine in doing that. But to me, it's just not very surprising that it ended up in Sheila's hands, and everything comes out after the fact that there's all these horrible plots going on, and you give someone the power of the state and they end up acting like a state.
Right. Yeah. Funny how that works.
Right.
Yeah. The power corrupts absolutely, Lord Acton style. Now I think she's going to actually go to her studio, and she's probably another 5-10 minutes out. So why don't we pass this off to Robert? You can get some of your stuff out before Sherry's back on, and then we'll dive into more questions with her.
Well, all my stuff is basically for Sherry. I mean, I'm really curious what her opinions on the show are. What her opinion of Sheila versus the Bhagwan, if she, these sorts of questions in terms of her experience with her organization. If
Okay, well,
whether or not she thought that they were an actual religion, because that seemed to be one of the sticking points with some other people I've discussed this with is whether or not the Rajneeshis are a religion, and if it's harmful, or because the Bhagwan, he just said, I'm a fellow traveler, I'm your dancing partner, and we're just going through this journey called life together, and I'm going to try and help you, and you can try and help me, and we'll just kind of do stuff together. And, I'm not going to actually prescribe. I'm not going to tell you to do anything. And to me, that really doesn't smack of religion. Religions to me are prescriptive. You will not do this. You will do this. You will worship on the Sabbath. You will bow down 5 times a day and pray to Allah. You will, not, will cover your women from head to toe and this and that and all sorts of, things thou shall and thou shall not do's. And it didn't seem like Osho really had any of that. Yes, they all wore pink and red and orange, like colors of the sunset for some reason. But it didn't, and maybe, if you came wearing not that, you were kind of frowned upon, and it's probably more likely that, those are just what was available for sale at the Rajneeshpuram store. I don't know. But what are your guys' opinions on whether or not this qualifies as some sort of religion? I am curious, honestly.
Well, I'll jump on that just for a second, but I think maybe we should wait until Sherry's back for the bulk of this portion of the discussion. But I will say that they used the legal defense of him being a religious leader to establish him being able to be present in the United States. So they sort of use that. They want both flavors of that, right? They want the cake and eat it too. They want to be a religion, but not be a religion. So it's a little bit contradictory. Granted, they're doing it to appease the state, to allow them to even be there to begin with. So they're sort of playing the game. But that's sort of my take on that initially. But before Sherry gets back, maybe we can get into the treatment of Bhagwan after he was arrested in North Carolina and how he was dragged across the country with our legal mind here, Patrick. But if you want to, Patrick, address Robert's question first a little bit, and then we get into the Osho treatment on the way back, and then Sherry will come back.
Well, I think whether they do or, whether it is a religion or not a religion, I don't think it matters, because we still have freedom of association, and that's still under the First Amendment, or at least we're supposed to have freedom of association. So, I'm not sure, what really qualifies as a religion. Is a religion a way of life? Is a religion having a shared spirituality? We would say that the state is a religion. It's a belief in the all powerful, that there's a group of people that have no liability and have the ability to initiate violence and force against everyone else. It's what defines religion? Is it faith? Is it a belief in a certain thing? Honestly, these are questions that I don't think about too often anymore.
Is it tax exempt status?
Tax exempt status. Yeah, right. Exactly. If you want it to be, if you would argue that it's tax exempt status. But when it comes to cruel and unusual punishment, this is not an area of the law that I've really spent a lot of time studying. Certainly not in preparation for this episode. But a big case that I'm just looking at now is Trop v. Dulles. It was an interesting case. It seems like let's see, I'm quoting here, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes page, but divestiture of the citizenship of a natural-born citizen was held in Trop v. Dulles, again by a divided court, to be constitutionally forbidden. So But I don't know, that might not be the right case to cite, but it seems to me like a lot. And what I remember from law school is just talking about what was meant by the Constitution. And this is my problem with constitutional law, is that you're always trying to determine what was meant in the Constitution and not necessarily trying to determine what is right and what is wrong. And so in trying to determine what cruel and unusual means, they'll look to, at the time of the Constitution, what was considered to be cruel and unusual punishment. And of course, as voluntarists, that's not really satisfactory. Also, in terms of due process, what does due process mean? I think that we have all these terms in the Constitution, and I think if we were to apply them to a contract, like a regular contract, say for snowplow or snow removal, you have a commercial lots and you have a snow removal service. Well, if the terms were as vague as the Constitution has in terms of terms, no court would find that to be a contract. So when you say due process, well, what does that mean? I mean, they've interpreted it to mean notice and an opportunity to be heard. But if this was a private contract and, or when it came to cruel and unusual punishment, and if this was a private contract between a private security agency and someone who is being prosecuted, and it was being interpreted by another agency, they would look at that term, cruel and unusual, and say, well, what does that mean? What does cruel and unusual mean? Does that mean that they can chase an ailing sick man across the country while he's on the run until he dies? Can they prevent him from seeking medical treatment? Is that cruel and unusual? I don't know. Do you know? Do you know what cruel and unusual means?
Well, let's rewind the tape a little bit and sort of describe the situation. So he had flown across the United States, stopped in a few areas, and got arrested in North Carolina. Now, he had won against the government a pretty significant legal victory. I think it was to establish that he could be there because he was a religious leader, even though he was silent for a period of time. And I think that was what the Swami, what was the guy's name? The lawyer guy?
Swami Pramnan.
Swami Pramnan was very effective in establishing that, they were able to win that case. And so I think that the government, once they arrested him in North Carolina, and whether he had been officially charged or not, I don't know. I don't recall. But they purposefully drug him across the country as slowly as possible within the confines of the regulations that they had in place. So they kept saying, oh, we could move him so far and put him in a different place so many times. And they purposely did that. So he was in 15 or 18 different prisons over the course of a month. And he's a frail guy. They're effectively torturing him in what would be a 7 or 8 hour flight. They took almost a month to drag him back to beat the fight out of him, because I think that they, having seen him go to court against them with his lawyer and the work that they were able to do, they were trying to break his will, break his spirit to fight any further. And to me, not a legal hat, but like a human decency hat, they went out of their way to torture this guy.
Yeah, well, definitely, yeah. But just to elaborate a little bit more on the Trop v. Dulles case, I believe these are quotes from the case itself, from the source I'm looking at currently. So let's see. Cruel and unusual punishment, quote, has to be a punishment more primitive than torture, or the total destruction of the individual status in an organized society. This is alluding to depriving someone's citizenship rights. So this was a case, it seems, because I haven't looked at this before this, but it seems like a case where they tried to revoke someone's status of citizenship, which is really funny. And they're saying that they're casting him into a state of statelessness, and that is considered cruel and unusual.
Where do I sign up?
Right, exactly. Yeah, do this to me. So inasmuch as it entailed statelessness or, quote, the total destruction of the individual statuses in organized society, that's a laugh, Quote, the question is whether a penalty subjects the individual to a fate forbidden by the principle of civilized treatment guaranteed by the Eighth Amendment. A punishment must be examined, quote, in light of the basic prohibition against inhumane treatment. And the amendment was intended to preserve, quote, the basic concept of the dignity of man. So you'd really have, and you would look at more case law here, but you would really have an argument over what are the basic, does this chasing him all over the country, transferring him to like 15 different jails, does that shock the conscience? Does that offend the basic dignity of man?
Yeah, they're caging the guy under threat of death and dragging him across the country to break his will to fight them anymore. And this was a guy who, I don't know if Robert, he must have been charged at this point, right? He must have been. But he wasn't convicted of anything. So he's still presumed innocent. Yes. Like, this is not a punishment as a result of being convicted and being found guilty. This is a punishment of vindictiveness. And this is a punishment of, before you're found guilty, and we want to make sure that you won't fight us any further, that you stop resisting. Right?
Right. Well, I want to just jumping off on exactly that point. I believe it was Michael Malice I heard recently make this point. Whenever you commit a crime, and I would say Osho is definitely guilty of this crime, you're not actually, it's a crime against the state, where there's actually no victim, it's just the state is upset with you. You're actually just committing the crime of heresy. And it's the crime of fighting back and resisting the state and actually defending yourself against the state. And that's like the ultimate crime that the state just can't deal with, can't wrap their mind around. You have to destroy that person, that thought, that idea. Because if that idea spreads, oh my God, we could just, not pay taxes. We could actually defend ourselves against the system. We could actually live free. No, you have to smash that idea out, destroy that person, because, they have to make an example of you. This is what happens to people who fight back and resist against their God. So that's exactly what Osho was guilty of, pretty much nothing else.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting you say too, it's the crime of heresy. Well, the crime of heresy, yeah, just like treason. Treason is one of like the most serious offenses that you can commit in this country. And just like heresy in the Middle Ages, what do they do to heretics? You're drawn and quartered. You get the most serious treatment that we give any prisoners, any offenders.
Yeah, there used to be a medieval method of killing a person, which involved using red hot tongs to tear out a person's flesh piece by piece as they were still alive. And if you passed out, they would wait until you woke up again before they started it again. And you had to have your flesh ripped apart for an hour while you were conscious before they would allow you to die. Just a fun little fact. But I don't know if that's cruel and unusual punishment, but that's what they used to do to people.
Yeah, I think that would be cruel and unusual, even under the Constitution. But right, we're just dealing with these really vague terms, and I remember just being kind of surprised in my, in law school, sitting there, hearing about all the things that were deemed constitutional, just because they're trying to go back to the ratification and see what was cruel and unusual at the time, or what would shock the conscience. It has to be really bad to be unconstitutional against the Eighth Amendment.
I think that's later interpretation, though. I think the original intent was that you as a person had natural rights that couldn't be violated, especially violently, ahead of time, or, like without being convicted and found guilty of the crime. And even that had restrictions on what the punishment could be constitutionally, I think, with the, like I said, the original intent. But I think case law muddies the waters. And I mean, you're a bit of the expert on this, but and I know it must be an internal struggle for you, not only with believing whether the Constitution is like a legitimate thing or not, but then the interpretations thereafter versus the original intent. So, I mean, you must be in a very difficult position, Patrick.
Well, I wouldn't consider myself an expert in any sense on this because there's such a wide body of law out there. Yeah, I've talked a lot about the Constitution in Liberty Weekly and in episodes past, and I just find it to be very arbitrary. Just the spirit of, and I know that I'm a believer in common law itself, but in the common law, the courts are trying to look to custom and precedent, or they're supposed to be traditionally looking to the custom and precedent of what society does in a certain time, and not necessarily trying to look to a piece of positive law like the Constitution. And usually what they do in constitutional laws, they look to a piece of positive law and they try and determine what it means, not based off of the precedent. They might, or not based off of, custom. They might use custom to try and interpret the positive law, but foundationally, they are trying to arbitrarily figure out what these words mean on this piece of paper. And I just don't find it to have any root in legitimacy. It's positive law. It has no root in natural rights or natural liberties or the customs of the people per se.
Speaking of language, I was listening to a Dave Smith episode recently, and he brought up the point that even the idea, the term, due process, innocent until proven guilty, is kind of a lie. Because if you're really assuming a person is innocent until they're proven guilty, then when you arrest that person, you're kidnapping an innocent person. When you hold them in a jail cell until trial, you're kidnapping and holding an innocent person until proven guilty. It just seems like, I don't know if there was a precedent at some point where, you would just say, hey, you're accused of a crime, show up at this jail cell or show up at this court on this date and we'll figure it out. And then eventually it got to the point where, now we just grab people and hold them in a jail cell until we run them in front of a court. Is it a gradual incrementalism in the courts? Because isn't that what court system is built off of? It's all built on past case law and what other courts have done in the past and decided in the past. And it sure seems like, we got this tyranny now. So, but it's got a past legitimacy because it's been used before. So there's precedent for it. So that's what we're going to continue on doing.
It's that creeping incrementalism, and sort of like the opposite of that cruel and unusual. It sounds like for cruel and unusual, it needs to be unique and not done before. But once it's been done, now it's no longer cruel and unusual. That doesn't make any sense. But then back to the heresy thing, I've got a Rothbard quote that I think will play right into this, because you're right. And I think Michael Malice is right that is the ultimate crime. And here's the quote. This is Murray Rothbard. Which category of crime does the state pursue and punish most intensely? Those against private citizens or those against itself, the state? The gravest crimes in the state's lexicon are almost invariably not invasions of private person or property, but dangers to its own contentment. For example, treason, desertion of a soldier to the enemy, failure to register for the draft, subversion and subversive conspiracy, assassinations of rulers, and such economic crimes against the state as counterfeiting its money or evasion of its income tax. And that's the end of the quote. But I would add the fighting them on their turf and beating them is also a huge crime to the state, because then they're going to come back for retribution.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Rothbard is really good on this too. I was, and Dan, or Robert, I want to get back to your question too, but Rothbard is really good on this in terms of holding people. And I should do an episode on this of holding people for bail. I believe it's in For New Liberty, where he talks about what it means to be a libertarian. He goes through the etymology of libertarianism as he sees it. But then he gets to the justice system and he kind of says that there's no reason why you should be holding someone who is merely suspected of a crime. And if you hold someone before their trial, before you've given them due process, and you adjudicate them not guilty, you find them not guilty, well, then you have some restitution to pay to them for depriving their liberty for however long you held them. And it's also interesting when you get into, and I can speak from personal experience on this because I've done bail hearings myself for the public defender's office, and they do keep this in mind. In Wisconsin specifically, you're not supposed to hold someone until trial unless they're a danger to the public, or you highly doubt that they will show up for their court date. So there is lip service given to liberty, but there's no restitution given at all. They do realize that they're depriving someone's liberty without adjudicating them guilty, but they haven't done so.
And those standards are all based on somebody's judgment, right? I mean, I think he's a flight risk.
Right.
So this is what we're doing is perfectly fine.
Right. And that's adjudicated in a proceeding where, you get your time in front of the judge, and you don't really discuss the underlying charge, but you just discuss, is this person a danger to the community? How serious are the charges? Are they a flight risk? Do they have connections to the community? Would it be a good idea to let them out? Will we see them back? How much do we want to charge to secure their appearance to make sure that they'll show up again? And then again, in order to, when it comes to serious crimes like felonies, there's no gross misdemeanors in Wisconsin, but in Minnesota, certain, felonies, there has to be a finding of probable cause to sustain the charges. So if you're being charged with a felony, you have to have a conference or a hearing in the beginning where it's past your bail hearing, but you'll have it's called a probable cause hearing, a PC hearing, where they go through the complaint, and the prosecution will argue that there is probable cause to find that so-and-so, murdered so-and-so, it's somebody else. So they do have due process in mind, and every step of the way they do adjudicate these things. But from a libertarian standpoint, in a stateless society, if you had competing arbitration systems, you would have the system only charging people if they were like 80% sure that they were guilty, because otherwise they'd have to fork up the restitution if they ended up charging someone out and going to trial and turns out he's innocent. Well, pay me all of my salary for the time that you held me in jail. This could be months, but this would also increase or decrease the wait time for trials and things like that.
All right. They'd be on the hook for it. They'd have some liability on their side. And I can see something like that kind of taking place in a naturally, spontaneous order situation. Related to your point about felonies and gross misdemeanors, there's a book that came out a while back, Harvey Silvergate, where he estimates that every average American probably commits at least 3 felonies a day. And this relates to the discussion we had yesterday in our first attempt at doing this episode, and that is now Patreon bonus content for your libertyweekly.net Patreon people. And maybe you can throw a plug in on how people can get access to that. But here's a quote from the book. If you reside in America and it's dinner time, you have almost certainly broken the law. In his book, 3 Felonies a Day, civil liberties lawyer Harvey Silvergate estimates that the average person unknowingly breaks at least 3 federal criminal laws every day. This toll does not count for the avalanche of other laws, for example, misdemeanors or civil violations, such as disobeying a civil contempt order, all of which confronts average people at every turn. So I'm not sure exactly where that quote comes from, but I'll find it and give it to you for the show notes page. But this relates to our discussion last night, because Robert, you said that if you had been arrested, you wouldn't look at that as a stigma any longer, right? Because that was, I think, related to a trivia question that you had mentioned, that there was a question of what percentage of men have been arrested at some point in their life and spent a night in jail. But go ahead and run with that for a moment, Robert.
Yeah, that's what the question was. I recently did a pub trivia. We won. Thank you. I know you're all wondering. And the question was, what percentage of adult males in the United States have spent at least one night in jail? And it was between 7% and 20% are the 2 options that were given. And we thought about it, and we were thinking, and the more we discussed it, we kept coming up with names of people who we knew that had been to jail. And, I'm thinking about these people, and they're all just like perfectly normal people. They're not like troubled people. They're just normal guys that I wouldn't mind hanging out with. I mean, who cares? And I think back to myself as a younger man, and, I think probably one of the goals of a parent is to, not have their kid spend time in jail. Probably. I don't know.
And keep them off the pole.
Off the pole. It's one of your jobs. But, and now as I've, I think at the time, I'm like, I don't want to go to jail. It ruins your life. You have this criminal record, it kind of stays with you. But these days, I find myself going, I could see myself in jail. I could see myself in jail for some ridiculous reason that I would completely feel like I was in the right the whole time, and they still threw me in jail. Like I never hurt anybody, no victim, no crime, but yet I'm still going to jail. I could definitely see that happening, and I wouldn't feel one bit bad about it. So for what happened, like when the Bhagwan was arrested, did he feel guilty? Did he feel like, he had done something wrong and he needed to atone for it? Are you kidding? He felt like he was being attacked and persecuted. And then he's just a perfectly normal person. He didn't deserve to be there. This is completely unjust. And these government thugs are completely ridiculous. So, I mean, if part of the justice system is to instill a sense of remorse and regret or something like that, like you regret having done X horrific crime or whatever, if you had actually harmed somebody, I would hope you would feel some sort of remorse and regret for it. But in the sense that the Bhagwan aggressed against anybody, that he committed a crime against anybody, are you kidding? How could anybody look at this case and go, man, I'm sure glad they got him, that evil so-and-so. Man, he needs to atone for his horrific crimes against humanity.
Yeah, all the actual crimes were committed by the government, which is
Yeah.
kind of ironic. And then here's the other thing that really stood out to me is when they brought him back to trial, I think the assistant district attorney was talking to the media. They're like, well, why did you guys catch him just to let him go? And they said, well, we had to show him, like who's boss. We had to bring him to justice.
It was a gangster move.
Yeah, which all they did was drop the charges and let him go. Or as long as he left the country, right? I mean, wasn't that like the resolution of this thing?
Yeah, it's like, we'll drop charges if you just leave, which is what he was trying to do anyway. But it was just them, just being gangsters, showing their gangster, thug mentality and their thug abilities.
Bullshit posturing.
Yeah. We're the bosses. You need to know this. Don't ever commit this heresy again and get out of here. So, I mean, there's your lesson.
So, Pat, you still want to be a lawyer?
I asked you don't know how many times I've asked myself that same question. But just because the process of becoming a lawyer sucks. But there was another thing I wanted to touch on too, and I've done some work on this as well just recently in the past few episodes about this idea. I talked about it with James Corbett, this idea of positive law being behind pre-crime and being the progressive era being intertwined with positive law, and the idea of pre-crime and setting up sting operations, which is a progressive type thing from the progressive era. But also another thing that I touched on just briefly and alluded to, and I think I misspoke when I said the death penalty was a part of this positive law aspect. But one thing that most certainly is pretrial detention. And that comes directly from my source, was this idea of imprisoning people before you've adjudicated them guilty. And Bruce L. Benson talks about this a bunch in The Enterprise of Law when he runs through the entire history of, from the Anglo-Saxons, then the Norman invasion happening, because the Anglo-Saxon system was a bit more libertarianish. You could pledge yourself to these roving warlords. But it was, you could kind of choose, if you were in the class of free men, you could kind of choose where you were going to go. And it was based on kind of a common law system. But then the Norman kings come in, and the Norman kings start to get a bit more power. And I'm just painting broad brushstrokes here, but what they tended to do gradually, as Daniel was alluding to, is they gradually took these crimes that used to be private offenses against individuals and subsumed them and created them and turned them into being crimes against the king, or crimes against the authority figure who had dominion over that geographic area. So it's interesting that we do see those things developing over time. I would definitely recommend that book, Bruce L. Benson's The Enterprise of Law. It's a gem for these kind of things.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to throw a plug out here. I've been putting together, reconstructing the readrothbard.com website. The platform it was on was no longer being supported, so I've been moving it over to WordPress. And I just happened to come across that snippet, that quote that I had mentioned earlier about which crimes are more aggressively pursued by the state in the process of putting that together. And so right now, just to continue my plug for a moment, the readrothbard.com site now has a little mini book review to all of his books, except for The Progressive Era. I'm still working on that one. And about 30 of his lectures, and I have another 70 lectures to put up there. And then eventually I'm going to get to putting individual articles up. So it's going to be fully built out. It's going to be your one-stop shop for all things Rothbard. It's super awesome, and it looks great. It's a huge improvement, very similar along the lines of what was done to libertarianunion.com recently to make that a little bit more spiffier. Oh, wait, she's back.
I'm
Yeah.
finally here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I'm so sorry. But now I'm out in Oak Ridge, the belly of the beast. So,
Oh, you got power for days there.
yeah. What doesn't go to the government? Yeah. I really appreciate you guys being so understanding. My internet hasn't gone out for, I don't know, what?
Years?
Oh, wait, canceled. There's something going on here. Yeah, it hasn't gone out for a long time. And then all of a sudden, twice in 2 nights. It's crazy.
They know, Sherry. They know.
Yes, they do. The drones are on their way.
Well, it's beyond your control, so I don't feel bad about it at all. But let me grab a LaCroix. I'll be right back.
Okay.
All right. Well, Robert, while you were gone, had an interesting angle. So why don't we just get started on that? Robert, go ahead and take it away.
Watching the documentary, first of all, did you guys consider yourselves a religion? And watching the documentary, did you consider the Rajneeshis a religion?
Well, like I said before, they sort of were anti-religion, but really it's the word religion because they saw religion as the man-made things, the trappings of the church, so to speak, rather than the actual spirituality. But it is a religion. I would consider the Rajneesh religion as well because they have a leader, they have rituals, they have a spiritual path, a goal, if you will. So I would consider them a religion. I don't know if they would consider themselves that. They may be more like the Buddhists that sort of don't consider themselves a religion, but more of a guidelines for life. So I'm not sure how they would view themselves.
And Robert, just to jump in, earlier I said that they were playing the government's game to qualify as a religion. It felt to me like the Bhagwan's speech at the end of that was an attempt to pivot away from being a religion. So he tried to distance himself from being a religious leader because I think that was maybe better positioning for him in trying to defend himself from the additional allegations and additional charges that were about to be brought to him.
Right. No, I saw that whole him, applying for religious worker status was just as a way to keep him in the country. I mean, that was just him playing the game. Like his lawyers came to him. It's like, hey, what can we do? Okay, well, we can maybe qualify as a religious worker. Okay, sure, fine. Let's do that. Because from everything he said and everything he did, sure seems like he wasn't a religious leader and never thought of himself as a religious leader, regardless of what other people thought of him as. I mean,
I don't.
there's been all kinds of different media and movies and TV shows kind of playing off this idea of somebody says a thing. I think like, Life of Brian is a good example. Or, Futurama, where Bender is like this floating in space and he's got all these little creatures living on him.
Yeah.
Where, you say some things and people like you and they want to follow you and listen to more of what you say. And you never declare yourself as any sort of a leader, but you seem to say popular things that people like to hear. I mean, does that make you all of a sudden some sort of religious leader?
Yeah. I think all of Christianity is sort of that way. Christ never, when they brought accusations to him, he would say, that's what you say. He never really defined that for himself. But I actually saw this whole incident where he was sort of washing his hands of everything bad by saying, well, it was all these people. And I don't know that that's the case. The man was very intelligent, clearly, and I don't think that he distanced himself at first as a religious leader. I think he was more than happy to play that, or for people to at least think that. But when things were bad and the state was after him, then he could say, well, that was all these bad people. But what it also did was it serves to keep people in his sphere of influence. So if he can say, well, this was the bad people that were in our group and now they're gone, all that's been purged. So you can keep hanging out with me because I'm actually still a good guy. I don't know. It sort of seemed to me like that was more what was going on.
Yeah. And can we talk about the blunder of when the Bhagwan was saying, hey, it was all these other bad people. Can you come in and investigate this, please, FBI? I mean, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
What,
Never
how
invited
naive
him.
do you have to be
Yeah.
to be like, we're just going to let these FBI guys in and they're just going to look in the places we want them to look and they're just going to investigate the people we want them to investigate? Are you kidding me? You've been a target of these people for how long? And you think they're not going to also go after you once you let them in the door?
Yeah. I think they believe the federal lie. I mean, you still hear it at the end where after he's arrested, where he says, I believe the Constitution of the United States is the best constitution and it's gonna, set me free, basically. Where I think they really believed the lie that, we're the government and we're here to help. Like I think they really thought that these protections, which hadn't protected them, the people in the town didn't actually believe the principles within it, and the state government didn't believe their principles within it, and now the federal government also didn't. So I kind of felt sad at that kind of naivete of and them as outsiders looking in and seeing all the religious freedom and things that we're supposed to have, and then coming to pass that because you're different you don't get it.
Right, but shouldn't they have learned their lesson by that point? I mean,
You would think.
you would think that they've had firsthand accounts of the untrustworthiness of government. To think that the Oregon government's, the Antilopian government's going to be bad and corrupt. Okay, then the Oregon state government's bad and corrupt.
And
But,
Wasco
then
County.
the federal government, they can't be bad too. It's like, okay.
It's like every level is like a deeper circle of hell.
This is Russian dolls.
Yeah. It's
But
pretty bad.
Sherry, can we talk about, because I'm curious about, you've only left this group that you were in about a year ago,
Yeah.
but you've you seem like you're really well familiar with the concepts of liberty, enough to host a podcast, several podcasts, and appear in other podcasts. And so you had to have started your journey, while you were still within this group. Did the group kind of help you? Were there some like-minded individuals in it? Or how did you come about doing this?
Well, yes and no. So they, like most of the rest of the country, have this idea that they believe in freedom. But really, they have the structure of the group was set up to be ground up. It was set up to be small in-home church communities that took care of each other and sort of had this beliefs that it was centered around, but you did in your little, fellowship what was best for that group. But of course, over time, it became more and more top down, and there was a lot of control. So they did see themselves as outsiders in a way, but also as freedom lovers. So many of them, some of them, I guess, just had, were familiar with Ayn Rand and things like that. But are basically like your average neocons in a lot of ways. But I I think libertarianism actually helped me leave the group. And the more libertarian I got, the less I would let myself be under their authority. And I think it really, one of the big breaks for me, I didn't actually leave the group then, but it took another year or so. But they had a big thing about being debt free, right? So everyone was supposed to be debt free. And they realized, that some people were still working their way out of debt. And I personally didn't have any, but they called and said, we're just, wondering if you're out of debt, if you have any debt. And it was the first time that I didn't just say, well, no. I said, well, I respectfully disagree to answer that question. And so, because it was none of their freaking business. So that was like the first time I remember really kind of making a stand against what they wanted me to do. And so I think the more libertarian I got, the more I started to question, well, why am I listening to these people? I don't agree with a lot of the things they say. I'd had problems with some of the doctrines for a long time. But it's that community, again, it's the community that really ties you. I think Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind said belief binds and blinds. And there were a lot of good things I learned in that group. But the bad things were really bad. And it's a prison of the mind, I guess you could say. And it takes a while to come out of that. And you're going to lose friends and relationships. And these are people that I did love. I still love many of them. But I just started realizing that no one had the right to my life that I had given them. So I don't know I hope that answers the question.
Sure. Yeah. I can echo that sentiment fantastically. So was there so really you're saying that, some people had heard of like Ayn Rand and that sort of thing, but was there any real big, that, them asking and telling you that, they had a right to know if you were in debt or not, and that kind of like triggered something in your mind.
Sounds like the IRS.
Yeah.
Kind of does.
And over the years, it had gotten more and more authoritarian, more and more controlling. Because when I first started going, it wasn't quite like that. It was much more like I said, the hippie type ideas were still in it. And then as it became more isolated and insular, it got to a point where if we were going to travel anywhere, we had to let the person who coordinated that state, if I was going from Michigan to Tennessee, I had to let the coordinator of every state I was going to travel through know I was going to be there, when I was going to be there, how long I was going to be there, and where they could reach me. And it was all for my protection, right? My spiritual protection. Uh, and I also remember when I got pregnant with my son, we had moved from Colorado here back to where I'm from, Tennessee. My father was dying. I was 6 months pregnant, making this cross country move. And my stepbrother died suddenly at 13, a month or two before my dad died. And I had just had a baby 6 months earlier before my dad died. So there were a lot of transitions in my life. And I was going to a meeting with my fellowship coordinator, and he was, lovingly concerned about how little time I had been spending with the household, which is, the group of believers. And I had said to him, well, for many years, I had damaged the relationships with my family. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. And my father was dying. And so I'm going to take care of him. And I don't care if you don't like that. So that was another like jarring moment for me where I'm going, God, I'm going through all this stuff and you're concerned about how much time I'm spending with the household. So I think they could feel they were losing their grip on me. There were many times where I would not go for a couple months because I was starting to pull away. It took a long time.
Now, did you leave all by yourself, or did you have some people go that went with you? Was there like a formal moment where you declared, I'm never coming back here again, or describe that?
Yeah. So at the time that I left last year, things had there was a big scandal with the former president several years before that. And so they had kind of switched gears. I wouldn't say it was less controlling. There was the facade of less control, but there was still a lot of control in people's lives. The president was now a woman, and she had a different style of leadership. But there was a group of leadership that had gone to her and said, this was never meant to be a top-down organization. We want to go back to the way it was supposed to be, where people's needs are getting met. Like there were a lot of things going on, and these people had tried for a couple years to see some headway in the change in the leadership positions on things. And when they didn't do that, they decided to leave that group. So we got a call saying, these people who we loved dearly, they had been ministers who had given their lives completely, and had always been there for us, that, they were no longer standing with the household and blah, blah, blah. And so I said, you know what? I said to my husband, I'm done. This is it. Because I had been telling him for a while, I don't want to do this anymore. How are we going to get out of this? And I said, that's it. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And he was finally ready as well. So we called him and said, you know what? We're not going to be coming back. And it was tough, but I think we were both just at a point where we were ready. And that we didn't go with that other group either. I guess that was the other group wanted us to come with them as well, the group that had split off. But we just decided that we were done with it all for the moment, and to regroup and I got married at 18, 2 weeks before I graduated high school. So I had never known life without a certain level of control, because I joined this group at 13, and I just wanted to be free of it all. So.
Well, not to compare your experience to, say, like the experiences of people that have been in Scientology, but if you watch that documentary called Going Clear, all about that,
Yeah.
the people who have left that group have famously been very attacked, and smeared. and ostracized from anyone else that's still in the group.
Yes.
Has there been any kind of backlash for you in your experience?
No, there has been in the past with people who have left this group. I mean, there were people at some points that left in the middle of the night, and you would just wake up and they would be gone from one of the campuses or something, when the group was much, much more isolated. But at this point, people still talk to us. We're not, so they go by the principles of mark and avoid that are it's in the Bible, where if you go to someone and say, they have a fault and they don't take care of it, then you go to another, your leadership, and I'll talk about it. And then if they don't correct themselves, you may mark and avoid them. So you mark them as someone who doesn't want to be corrected and avoid them. So it's basically excommunication. And they don't practice that quite as much as they were. But we haven't been that because we're not actively out talking bad about the group, I guess you could say. I mean, this might be considered that.
Yeah,
I don't
until
know.
now.
Yeah. But we still have friends that those relationships are kind of non-existent, but we occasionally on Facebook, I'll still say hi or whatever, or they'll invite us to something, like a family, if they have family in town that we wanted to see, whatever. But there's not been, I think I've only been around them once since then, and it's a little awkward. It's not like it used to be though, where you're considered some kind of terrible person for not being a part of the group anymore. And maybe that's just because they want us to come back eventually or something. But yeah, there's a lot of lovely people, and I think this is what I saw in the documentary, is that clearly these people are getting a need met, some kind of need, whether it's a community need or they feel a spiritual need is being met. And I'm sure there are a lot of lovely people involved. And my experience overall wasn't all bad. I learned a lot of great things. This group really taught me how to live life, how to manage my finances, how to, you know, do many, many things. But you do give up a certain level of control when you go to the authority of this group and say, you guys have the answers and I want them, give them to me. I'm going to be a part of you. And I saw that in this group. It seems like Osho had a lot to offer, and there were a lot of good things that came out of it as well. So that's why I don't like the word cult, because people think of Jim Jones or something, or, Heaven's Gate when you say cult, of these really, death crazed, they're headed that way cult type of groups. And my group wasn't like that. Not everything was good, but not everything was bad either.
Yeah, that was a charge levied against the Rajneeshis with the Jim Jones thing.
Yeah. Yeah. People get really, they're led by fear. A lot of people are led around by fear. And if it's something different, I think if the people in the town had just taken a little time to get to know the Rajneeshi and kind of being a little bit more accepting, that they probably still wouldn't have had to have them run the town, but they wouldn't have had this contentious relationship. But my group had the same kind of contentious relationship with a couple towns that surround its main international campus too. So, the local sheriff had deputized some people, because we used to have a big event in Ohio every year. And it was reported in the paper that we were taking over the local, police force, things like that. So stuff gets blown out of proportion because people who have a different agenda, that they just don't like your group because it's different, it's not what they would consider Christianity or consider right, then they skew the facts and it just spins out from there, and then you have a lot of contention. So I could definitely see
that was one of the things that really struck me, was the bit of the PR problem that the Rajneeshis had, that really was exacerbated by Ma Anand Sheila's kind of media tour that she went on, kind of challenging people and arguing with people, and instead of really depicting themselves as victims or or be people that were under attack and needed help, as really just like people that were there to fight and really to conquer and take over. And I wonder, I don't know about your situation, but what has been your that group's PR strategy, or is it just to like stay low and under the radar, or to be visible? I mean, you've never really kind of been attacked though, or that group has never really been attacked, sort of. You say you've had some government kind of surveillance and that sort of thing. I mean,
Yeah.
which is true of us all, I suppose. But
Yeah, the group that I was involved with has been attacked many times. I mean, they've had a lot of bad press, and not all of it undeserving. Um, there have been different articles over the years. I've known people who have been kidnapped and deprogrammed, those kinds of things, or tried to be deprogrammed, whatever. So there definitely was that kind of intense scrutiny of the group. Many cult literature will have our group listed in it. So
wow. So there, in your experience though, it's really, not like just the idea of there being a PR strategy is really just kind of to lay low, or have you actually, do you know that you've bought positive news stories? Because that's a thing,
right.
you could do these days. You could pay a reporter to write a positive news story. That seems like something that Rajneesh's never even thought to try to do.
Yeah,
But
it sort of depends on who was in control of the organization at the time as to the kind of strategy that they took. I think when it first started, people were really concerned because it was the Jim Jones thing happened during that same time, and so there were a lot of comparisons made because they were a sort of Christian group that had moved on to their own place, and so there was a lot of parallels that were drawn, and people were afraid, and so they weren't really interested in hearing how you were different or whatever. But yeah, the strategies changed over the years. Now it's sort of this, I don't know, milk toast, uh, just really. It seems very weak. It's not the big push that it has been in the past, but they have a missionary program that's 6 months that I actually went on years ago, and uh, it's they're out there. They're just not. They're trying to seem more mainstream, I guess you could say, only with the same beliefs that they've always had, but they are trying to have an effort to open up and seem more like, well, we're just another group uh, type PR, I guess is the best I can explain it.
and as far as you know, they don't have any plans on buying a giant ranch out in the middle of nowhere and building a city.
Well, they own a couple of campuses, one in New Knoxville, Ohio, and one in Gunnison, Colorado. So they used to own a university in Emporia, Kansas, but they sold that um, probably 10 or 15 years ago. So that those claims have been made. I know that there've been articles written that because we were that group the group I was involved in was very pro Second Amendment again, and they had this article once. I think it said that we had a stockpile of weapons in the water tower at the Gunnison, Colorado location. So, which I mean, it was crazy. But anytime a group is different and they carry guns, it scares people. And they mentioned it several times in the documentary that waving an AR-15 in your face or whatever. And I kind of feel like the Rajneeshi, like the group I was involved in, felt like they might need to protect themselves, and so that's why they did it. It wasn't because they were wanting to hurt people, but they did want to protect themselves.
Yeah, if I recall, they didn't actually get the firearms until after their hotel got blown up, right? So it was clearly a response.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think just that the state minions don't like to see the slaves armed, and it makes them uncomfortable because they like to, feel in charge and in power and in control of every situation they're in. So
Yeah.
when they come up against people that are actively, know that they're human beings and have self-ownership, and whether or not they're aware of these concepts or not, they were clearly aware of the right to defend themselves. It makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting that I think it was either the Oregon Attorney General or the U.S. Attorney General that had said, um, after they had done all this wrangling, they had, that the townspeople had tried to use the law against them, and when the Rajneeshis used the law, it was terrible that they did it. They were evil and trying to take over, but it was all good when they were trying to, use the proxy force on the Rajneeshi. And when he got the case, I think it was the federal guy, and he said, something about if they can't or won't conform and obey our laws and all this stuff. And it was like the law they only cared about the law when it serves them. Otherwise, they were just probing and trying to see where they could attack the Rajneeshi, but they had no, like when they tried to get him for immigration violations, they had no reason to do that. He was clearly a religious leader, and they just they weren't satisfied until they could find a way to try and bring these people down. And they didn't care about the law when they wanted to not do, when it held them in or held them back from doing what they wanted.
Yeah, I can completely agree with that. Now, I know people will say that I have been completely on the side of the Rajneeshis almost this entire series, and that's probably mostly true. Where, if you hold any kind of a blame against any of the Rajneeshis, where do you think that they crossed the line? Because, in my mind, Sheila was definitely somebody that was, like a pit bull that once you unleashed her, she was going to do some crazy stuff. But, you know, she was only unleashed as a defensive measure because they were being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
So, the whole snowball begins with the Antilopians essentially attacking the Rajneeshis. But do you lay any of the blame for any things that happened really kind of squarely at, any of the Rajneeshis' feet?
Um, yes, I think the food poisoning, if they actually did that, I don't know if it was ever really made clear that they did that in the Dallas, whatever they call that town, where the people got food poisoning, and they seem to think it was the Rajneeshi doing that. Um, I think if they were doing that, they were maybe casting a broader net at their target than they should have. Because surely not everyone in the town cared that much, or was against them. So I think they could have really harmed somebody. But again, when you're talking about who aggressed first, I think it's clearly the people in Antelope and I guess the Dalles and the government. But I don't know. I didn't think it was necessarily proportional. Some of the things they did, like trying to kill the attorney general or whoever it was that they planned on murder. I think they were going a little far there, and that would have definitely ended in their massacre. Um, so I think if there's blame to be laid, that's probably what I would say they're at fault for.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Just the proportionality of it. Like, I understand that they are being threatened. They
Mm-hmm.
are absolutely having their livelihoods under attack. But I don't know if the next step I would go to, especially before any kind of arbitration, where any kind of negotiations occur. Like, I don't know if, like, olive branches were, put forth on either side before Sheila just went to murder. Let's just pull the old murder train. Try. Why not?
Yeah,
Let's just
I
start
think
killing people.
that's what happens when people feel like they've run out of options, that you're not negotiating with them. I think the Rajneeshi really did want to, I think they sort of had this idealism that they were going to go in there, build their little utopia, and people were just going to want to be a part of that and want to know them and the people in the town. I just don't think they counted on the bigotry of the people in the area. And I don't want to, I guess bigotry might be a strong word. The fear, the tribalism of the people in the area. I think that maybe that they didn't understand how that was going to happen, because they were coming from India, which is a very deeply diverse spiritual religious country, and they're used to maybe a different outlook on these what we would consider exotic sort of religious practices or very strange things. It's not so strange there, and so I think maybe they just didn't count on how different they actually were from
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
normal.
The negative reaction to the culture shock, I think, is one of the main things that they didn't count on when they were, you're going to basically import thousands of people into this tiny little town, or not the tiny little town, 20 miles away,
Right.
but you guys all act so differently than, the natives. They're gonna look at this as something, a fair bit alien and react probably not positively to it.
Yeah.
Whereas I assume, when you're inside this group and everything's wonderful. You're laughing all the time, you're dancing all the time, you're having sex all the time. You're reaching this, kind of spiritual enlightenment. You feel like you're really a part of this something in this community, and you're like, well, how can anybody react negatively to this? This is all so wonderful. All we
Right.
need to do is show people, this truth, and they're just going to embrace it.
Yeah.
And I see real parallels to libertarianism and voluntarism. I feel like, well, I found this truth, and all I need to do is show people what it is.
Right.
And here's the arguments. And look at this. Isn't this great?
Yeah.
Don't you like it? And then the big response is, not really.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of parallels to that. That we can see the beauty of the system, and this is something that I have a hard time overcoming in my own personal life, is that communicating anarchism to people is very difficult, because there are so many moving parts that people are unfamiliar with, and if they're not ready to sort of have this imagination, if they have poor imagination, then they're going to have a hard time with anarchism, because so much of it is abstract to them. And we live in a society where people are they're just sucking on the teat of the government 24/7, and they don't know what to do without it, and it's very disorienting for them. So to think about a world without people telling them how to live and what to do, and it's not telling them, they want them to tell their neighbors. Nobody thinks that they need to be told. They think their
Right.
neighbors need to be told.
Exactly.
Yet they want those very same neighbors to go out and vote.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, we can't trust you to run your own life, but we can trust you to pick people to run your life for you.
Yeah. There was a lot of interesting rhetoric around protecting democracy in this documentary, because when the Rajneeshi had the numbers and voted and basically incorporated the town and set up the town council and all that, they were upset by that. But when they wanted to vote on something, they were very, very afraid that the Rajneeshi were going to have the numbers to do, whatever they didn't want them to do and take over. But they framed it in protecting democracy, when exactly what the Rajneeshi did was use that system properly according to the way that system is set up to be used. So they just didn't like that it was happening to them. They thought it was evil. They were calling these people evil because they were using the system that these people hold up as somehow sacred. So I just thought that was pretty hilarious.
Yeah, it's quite ironic. And I think that if the LP got any significant traction, they would get similar resistance from the state
Yeah,
because it's a threat
absolutely.
to its very existence, using their their mechanisms that they leave available. So I sort of disagree with Rothbard a little bit on this, because he was like, well, if they're going to be dumb enough to let you be able to have this avenue of voting to try to achieve some semblance of additional freedom, why not use it? But I just think they're going to change the rules on you. So
Yep. They did it to Ron Paul, and he didn't run as a he was even when he was a Republican, running as a Republican and talking to Republicans, trying to get in Republican debates. They didn't want to let him in because he didn't toe their line. So yeah, I mean they always do that. They do it. They've done it here in Tennessee with ballot access on the Libertarian Party here. So yeah, it's I hate to say it's a losing battle, but it's certainly we have to come up with different strategies, because I don't think that's gonna make us free. Like Michael Malice said, you can't vote yourself free, and you can't spend yourself wealthy or spend yourself rich. So I think that's very true.
Yeah, I
Right.
think there's a lot of lessons to be learned by libertarians in this documentary. Trying to use the system to your own advantage, it's just not going to end well. They're going to change the rules on you so that they win.
Yeah.
You might
every
get a
time.
few small victories here and there, but you also do get the attention, right? At least people pay attention to the political process every couple of years for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So it is at least a bit of a bullhorn. You get a little bit of an educational opportunity.
Yeah, that's
But
if you are worth with the Libertarian Party, if they actually have candidates that are libertarian and expressing libertarian ideas, then yes, it can be a platform to teach people. But I don't really see that happening with a lot of their candidates. So
yeah, I think that only works with principles.
yeah,
This mishmash of, well, we're sort of a blend of this and that, and kind of don't know
Yeah.
too much else. That doesn't get you anywhere.
I'm a pro-military libertarian. I love that one. That sounds great.
All right, Robert, do you have more questions? Because I think we want to give you an opportunity to get through as much as you've got there, as long as Sherry can keep on trucking here.
Yeah,
Well, I don't know how much longer we want to go. I think we've done a good job. I would really like to hear Sherry's take on Manan Sheila. But I think we can probably wrap things up if you want. Get into our final evaluations and our kind of reflections on the whole series, if you like.
Yeah, we could do that. Sherry, do you have any just last things that you wanted to say about your experience?
Well, yeah, I think I just think that we have to remember that these people aren't dumb. This is one of the things that has really this is the first time I've really talked publicly about too much about being in that group. And the reason is that people often say, well, how could you be so dumb? Or they see you as some kind of ignoramus that's being led by the nose. And there really is a I don't want to say that I was a victim of these people necessarily. I mean, I was very young and I was vulnerable when I got involved, but I did get a lot out of the group. And I'm not a stupid person, but there's so much that you're willing to go along with often when you're in these groups, because you see things from a certain perspective that's an inside perspective, that even maybe the power shifts, you see them in a different way than people outside might see them, and maybe sometimes people outside have a better perspective on if things are going negatively or positively, and maybe they don't. It's very difficult to tell, and I would like for people to understand that people who get involved in groups like this, it's not like you go in and all of a sudden you're trapped. It's subtle. It takes time, and there are relationships involved and emotions involved, and so you get things can get twisted, and you can put up with a lot thinking that you're doing the right thing. And we all want purpose. We all want to feel like we're doing something. And a lot of times these groups give people that purpose that they're looking for. And their heart is to genuinely help people and change the world a lot of times. And some people take advantage of that. So I would just, even when we're talking to people about the religion of the state, we can sort of keep that in mind, that these people, they really think that we're the good guys, right? They think we're always the good guys, and that we're the city on a hill and all that stuff. And so we can take that into consideration, that these people they don't, the state is evil, the people are practicing evil in a way, but they're not evil themselves. They just are ignorant in a lot of a sense, a lot of times. So I guess that's it.
And I
Yeah,
can I can have some sympathy or like understanding for adults that want to get together in one of these groups. I have no issue with that. But I do rankle when, and this is what was one thing that happened in the documentary and in the Scientology documentary as well,
Mhm.
is when children are brought up into these kind of groups. And it just reminds me of state education, because it really makes my blood boil that, children, 6 years old and up to 18 years old and more are essentially, indoctrinated in state schools to believe in this state religion. And so I'm curious, do you, is that something that upsets you, or did you, do you think that these children are also really just having a normal childhood and getting something really positive out of it? And
I think they can get something really positive out of it. I don't know. I always sort of took the route that I wasn't going to force my kids to, which is the same route my mom did. She wasn't going to force us to believe what she believed. And everyone I knew that was in my group, most of the people were like, my kids, you've got to go to fellowship. You've got to do this while you're living under my roof. And then I would see their kids sort of drift away and not want to talk to them. And because their kids want to be accepted by people as well. And, I always tried to, even when we left, I told my oldest son, not my younger child who was almost 7 at the time, but I told my son, who's much older, that, hey, if you want to go still, you're welcome to do that. I know you have relationships with people and you love these people, and you're old enough to make this decision on your own. And if you would like me to take you, I'll take you. And he didn't choose to do that. But um I do feel like in a lot of groups, children have no say in whether or not they're going to participate, that their parents just force them. And I think if a parent really believes that that's the truth, that they shouldn't have to force them, because
right,
it'll make sense to the kids and they'll want to do it. So you set an
right.
example. The best thing you can do is set an example of how you want your kids to live, and try and live it yourself, and let them make their own decisions, I think.
Yeah, right. Well, I always wonder why, it's always a joke amongst everyone that, oh, kids hate school. Ha ha ha. Kids dread going back to school. They hate some, or they love summer, they hate going back to school. Has anyone ever really examined this? And I'm not sure that kids absolutely love school back in the 1800s or anything, but we're all just sitting around here and joking about how kids hate school, but we never thought to think, well, maybe that's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's because it's not good for them. My daughter, we were unschooling last year, and that was actually great. But my daughter, we put her in a co-op, a homeschool co-op 3 days a week. So I'd have a little time to do work without her being right there, and then be able to focus on her when she's around. And they say the pledge. And I didn't know this, but she came home and told us they say the pledge, and she said, I stood there and I wasn't saying it, but some of the kids turned around and said, "You're not saying the pledge." And she said, "I don't want to say it." And they said, "You need to say it if you know it." And she said, "I just stood there, Mama, and I put my hand over my heart, but I didn't want to worship that." That's what she told me. So, she understood, but even at the second grade level in a homeschool co-op, she's feeling that kind of pressure. So, it's so entrenched in our culture. It's very difficult to get people out of that. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and in ways that, I'm sure as we all, well, I'm a little newer to libertarianism than I think than some of you guys are here, but I'm still confronting those unconscious things that I just haven't really realized yet that are contradictory or a product of being in public schools my whole time, or and then going to the University of Minnesota and sitting through 4 years of that, and then 3 years of law school as well, and all these things that are kind of subconsciously entrenched. But I think as we're closing up here, maybe we should say our final words on Wild Wild Country. Should we do the black and gold or the red and black as an homage to old Actual Anarchy episodes where we give our final grade? Obviously, black and gold being a good pass, and a black and red being bad. So I'll start with Daniel. What do you think, buddy?
Well, yes, I think it is kind of appropriate to resurrect that for a little bit. We did change to a numbering system at the beginning of the year when we introduced the Last Nighters version of the show, because we didn't think that normies would necessarily understand what the heck we're talking about. But yeah, overall, this was a very well done documentary, and it did bring up a whole plethora of libertarian ideas and concepts to kind of sink our teeth into. And I know Robert, when he saw it, he was very excited to do this. He had asked us to, can we take on a series? Can we do something like this? Because it's so good. And so when you had your bar exam prep, it presented itself as an opportunity to kind of like make something happen along these lines. And I'm glad that we did it. It was really good, a good experience. And I think that the entire thing is worth viewing. I'd recommend that people do watch it and then listen to these series of episodes at libertyweekly.net/WWC to get some perspective and some analysis on it, and maybe some takeaways. Because I think that a lot of the tactics that the government uses and the ideas of fighting for that ring of power ends up blowing up in your face. And I think that's the key takeaway. So overall, black and gold for me, well worth the time invested and the additional time that we put into making this series, as well as this super long expando episode here at the end, wrapping it all up.
As voluntarists and ANCAPs and libertarians and whatever else we self-identify as, we understand that radical ideas can make people uncomfortable. And Bhagwan was nothing if not at least some sort of a radical. I mean, it's not that there haven't been gurus and there haven't been religious leaders and there haven't been these figures that from time to time kind of challenge the establishment. And it always ends up, upsetting a lot of folks. A lot of people look at these people as something new and alien, and often, when there's something alien, you fear it. And on top of the fear that the Bhagwan and all the Rajneeshis got, the Bhagwan was also a boss, and he lived my dream. He made a luxurious living by pontificating about life and having people hang on his every word. And that's basically my dream. He also had consequence-free sex like a rock star with a line of women that stretched around his own city block. And when you have the level of success and level of game that the Bhagwan had, you attract an equal number of haters. And so it's no surprise that the Bhagwan, whose game was in the stratosphere, I mean, women were worshiping the ground his chauffeur drove his Rolls Royce over. So you would expect that massive numbers of people would just hate him. And it was very clear in the documentary that there was a lot of jealousy and there was a lot of fear and like misunderstanding and just unknowing, like, what is this guy? Even though he wrote books, there was still not a lot of curiosity, no real effort involved to understand him or his ideas. And so they just kind of painted him with this broad brush of, new and other and danger. And this documentary does a fantastic job of showing, I think, both sides. Although I came across, obviously very much on the side of the Rajneeshis and the Bhagwan. I think you can still have some sympathy for the Antilopians and their kind of world being turned upside down a little bit. I still think that they're a bunch of statists who got their panties in a bunch when, their lives were a little bit changed. Boo-hoo, cry me a river. But, it really comes down to who aggresses against who. And I don't think there's any kind of question that the Antilopians absolutely aggressed against these people who just wanted to hug and laugh and have sex. And so, as someone who also wants to love and hug and have sex, I tend to come down on that side. So anyway, if you've come with us this far, I hope you've already watched this, but recommend it to your friends. It's absolutely black and gold, not black and dot gold, black and gold.
Hey, that's my website. It's one of my websites, Black and Dot Gold.
I'm trying to help you out, Daniel. I'm trying to pluck you.
Thank you.
Subconsciously.
And because we're awkwardly talking about it now, it's going to be more indelible. So there
That's
you
right.
go. Black and
We're
Dot Gold,
shining a
everyone.
light on it.
Not
So,
.com,
yeah.
.gold.
Watch the series. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about these issues. It's something that can bring people together. I mean, everybody's got Netflix. Even people, your statist friends are going to maybe watch it, get their thoughts on it, and give them your thoughts on it. It's a great conversation starter. So big black and gold for me. Sherry?
Yeah, I thought that the documentarians did a fantastic job of being respectful to everyone, and to each side, even though I like you am more sympathetic to the Rajneeshis. Um, I think they did a good job of trying to be fair and trying to be respectful of everyone in a situation where that can be really difficult. And to remember that this documentary, it's 6 episodes and they are fantastic, but these people really lived these lives, and that there were, not every story can be told. And so um this covers years and years of people's lives, so I'm sure there's much more to it. And I don't think the Rajneeshi were 100% pure and light and all that, and I don't think that the townspeople or of course the federal government is not. um but I think they did a really good job of trying to give everybody's side as honestly as they possibly could and keep a narrative going. I also believe that this is a great study in humanity and a great study in people and how fear affects people. And not only in the context of just how fear affects people, but how people in the United States who are your normie types, status, like you said, are going to see any type of difference. And of course, this happened, what, 20, 30 years ago. So things have changed a little, but in a lot of ways, they stay the same. And I know, especially here in the South, uh, a lot of times people can get an idea. They put you in a box, like the cult, the word cult, they put you in that box and that's who you are. And you're not going to make any headway with them. And they're just going to fight you. So I think we can see how escalation happens in this, how the state uses law against people and the voting system. I mean, there's so many different aspects that you can you can see throughout this video. So I think, or this series. So I think this is definitely black and gold for me. And I've recommended it to a bunch of people already because I think there are a lot of valuable lessons to be learned from it. As people who are sort of idealists and want to change society, hopefully we can learn a few things and do things maybe a little better and realize that it is an uphill battle, and these ideas don't just sell themselves necessarily. We've got to figure out how to sell it to people.
Yeah, and Sherry, why don't you want to send the audience somewhere where they can follow your work?
Sure. I wrote it down because I've got a new one. I am on, let me see here. Well, I can't find it now, but SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, TuneIn, and now the Google Play Store. You can find me there. And of course, Facebook at the Sherry Voluntary Show or just Sherry Voluntary. I'm at all those places.
All right. Well, we'll include some links in the show notes page as well at libertyweekly.net/92. My closing remarks are just kind of echoing, everyone's sentiment, but Sherry's sentiment as well. I think this is just chock full of parables. And as people who are often charged with being idealistic or saying, you have all these theoretical ideas, these are things I've heard in my own career. You have all these theoretical ideas, but you don't know how the real world works. And when you meet the real world, your ideas will change and you'll become more pragmatic. But I think we can point to things that have happened in the real world and explain exactly how and why they happened with the non-aggression principle insight and our libertarian insights. But another thing that Sherry was talking on, I just wanted to briefly reflect on, was how all this is, a lot of fear and a lot of emotion and human psychology and perspective. Perspective is so interesting because even now there was the Antilopian mayor, and I think he had a big walrus mustache, and I don't remember his name, but he was saying, well, now a big Christian youth camp bought the land that the Rajneeshis used to live on. And well, from a different perspective, that's just another, cult, if you want to say it. They practice total abstinence. I think it probably affects the Antilopians just as much as the Rajneeshis did before this whole conflict. You're talking about increased foot traffic, increased infrastructure, probably, a lot of buses going in and out and people stopping by your town in traffic. But the whole reason why it's okay is because it's, something that isn't too foreign to us, even though he was saying in its own way, they're very weird as well. So an interesting part of human psychology. And I would just like to thank all the guest hosts that I've had on the show while I've been studying for the bar exam. I get my results on the 29th, so we'll see how that is. And I totally regret telling everyone about it because now I have to tell everyone whether I passed or didn't. But definitely, thank you so much, Tony, and Trey was on, and the boys from Peaceful Treason, and definitely Daniel and Robert. I know we really wanted to pick away at this, and there was so much to get at, but I think it turned out really well, and best of all, I think it brought us all together. So thanks, everyone, so much. Once again, you can find that and the rest of the series at libertyweekly.net/WWC. And if you feel so inclined as to help support the Liberty Weekly podcast on Patreon, there's a whole bunch of bonus content from these conversations and former conversations in the other episodes. But especially, we attempted to record this episode last night, and there's a whole hour and a half of content from that recording session too. So talking about this and a whole slew of other things. So patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. But thank you so much to our guests, and thank you again to Sherry Voluntary.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun.